Thank you all so much, and thank you, Eli, for being here.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone at Blue Sky for inviting me and having me and putting together this beautiful exhibition. I really, really appreciate all the care that went into putting the show on. So thank you, guys. It's my first time in Portland. Really loving it. It's an amazing city. I personally have always preferred artist talks that sort of go a little bit behind the scenes or show you the origins, the missteps, the mistakes, the failures, just like the process of how one got to make that work versus just like, here's the show. So that's what I'm gonna do. So I hope that's of interest to y'all. I'm gonna start way back in undergrad. These are some of the first art photographs that I made when I was at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. I was not an art major. I was an American Studies major. Studied literature, gender, race studies, and that really informed why I started taking photographs. And that's always sort of been the lens through which I was making work versus like a more formal maybe approach. I actually thought I wanted to study cinema. Wesleyan has a very good cinema, very famous cinema program. I would say film, but that's always confusing. But I became pretty disenchanted with how industry-centric it was. It's a very Hollywood-based program versus independent cinema or art making. So while I was taking all my intro cinema classes, I was also taking intro to film, photography, and it was just so completely different, right? It wasn't about how you fit in within this huge industry. It was just like, here's your 35 millimeter black and white camera, go out, make photographs. And that was appealing to me for many reasons, but one, because I felt like I could learn things about the world. I mean, I was like 19 years old. I didn't know anything about the world, right? Not that I know that much now, but I just felt like I could go out and make work and actually learn about things versus like having to know something already, which I felt I did not know anything. So these are all photographs I made in undergrad. Again, I was really thinking about using the camera to look at the construction of sort of a normative American identity. Not that obviously that exists, of course, that is the actually great thing about America, but of course we think it exists. It's a politicized issue. It's obviously extremely contested who gets to be, right, a normative American. And so I was really interested in that and using the camera to look at the world and think about the way the world is shot through with ideology or meaning is projected onto people or the landscape in some way, right? And again, it's like this, I was an American Studies major, so this is really like what I was learning about and reading about and thinking about. I was interested in this idea of like types or archetypes or the way we embody certain characters, right? Like the suburban mom or the high school dropout. Not that, of course, that we can be defined with these very reductive terms, but certainly we're influenced by them, right? We internalize them. We think about ourselves in these ways. Oh, I need to be this. I need to act like that, right? And the effect that has on us, right? The way we embody these roles or these types. Norms, right? The way we internalize norms. So like the jock, like the hobble jock with the leather jacket, trying to look for these sort of like loaded sort of like archetypes or figures in some way and think about the tension between that type and then the real person, the actual flesh and blood person. This is a photograph in Kansas where my mom's from, where Bob Dole was also from, which is why that is Bob Dole Drive. I was photographing, these are mostly medium format from the Mamiya 7. I was using a flash, both out of necessity, because I was like in spaces that I was shooting quickly, couldn't set up on a tripod, wasn't much available light. But I also liked kind of the edge it gave the photographs. It sort of kept them from being too sentimental, right? From like falling into the trap of certainly like romanticizing these roles or these ideas. There's a passage written by Daido Moriyama, the photographer that I love. He said, this is kind of paraphrased, there's no way that a single person can truly have a comprehensive view of the world, but it is possible for them to conceive of an outline of its totality. It is from the interplay between the extremes of the real and the ideal, as they are juxtaposed in their shudder, that meaning arises. So that was sort of, I feel like, kind of one of my guiding principles, right? This juxtaposition of the real and the ideal. And how impressively a photograph can describe, right, the surface of the world, yet how easily it can fall into metaphor or myth or symbol, right? So after I finished undergrad, I moved to New York City. I knew I wanted to stay connected to the photography world. I didn't really know what that meant or how to do that. So I started working at a printing lab called Griffin Editions in New York. I started assisting Joel Meyerowitz, the street photographer, which was just like, both were just incredible real world educations in photography and printing and the consumption of imagery, what imagery was being consumed in galleries and museums by collectors. I also switched to color because I was desperate to work in color. I had been using all like our black and white darkroom facilities, so it was really exciting to switch into color. And I also switched to 4x5, so I was using a view camera, which hopefully some of you have used a view camera before. It's extremely laborious, it's slow, right? It's like the Ansel Adams, like dark cloth type of camera. So it really changes how you make photographs. It's a little bit less spontaneous. You have to be a little bit more, I guess, deliberate in how you photograph. So obviously there are some technical changes, but from the point of view of what I was photographing, what I was looking for, it's really sort of that same idea, right? Looking at ideologies, fantasies we have about specifically suburban American spaces, right? Which are obviously so loaded and so full of, so contested in their meaning, right? These are two Mormons on their mission eating at McDonald's.
What town is that?
This is in New York. And one thing I was going to say is that one kind of very convenient thing about this project, like looking at suburban spaces, it's like I could go into New York, I could go to New Jersey, I could shoot in Texas where I'm from, and it all looks the same. It's very interchangeable, right? It's the same restaurants, same architecture, same parking lots, same big box stores, right? So that was one thing that was really appealing to me, whether I was in New York or whether I was home, I could keep working on this project. I got a little bit, I guess I sort of decided I wasn't that interested in a just like flat out sort of critique. Obviously the deficiencies or issues of suburban America are well trodden territory in the art world. And so I sort of like shifted my point of view. I was like, can I convince myself of like poetry or meaning or value in these spaces, right? Like, can I find something meaningful or sensational in like an extremely mundane space? Something that felt beautiful but also kind of disposable in the way that so many things, right, that we consume in America are. I also began staging or recreating things that I had seen, which is, of course, not a radical thing to do in art photography, but for me it was a shift in how I was making photographs from a more observational kind of style. So this, for instance, is a photograph. I don't know if you can see it, but this woman is wearing American flag contact lenses. And so I'd been at a music festival and I'd interacted with this guy who was wearing American flag contact lenses, and it was just like, oh my God. It's like, America is literally the lens through which he sees it. I was like, oh my God, it's like, this would be so dumb if it wasn't real, you know? But I didn't have my camera, I wasn't shooting, and so I was like, well, why can't I just remake it? Why can't I restage this, right? So this is something that I set up, but obviously it was sort of cut from the real world. Photographer Robert Adams talks about William Carlos Williams, the poet, and quotes William Carlos Williams, who says, no ideas but in things. And this for me was such a good example of like this, you know, sort of theory or idea, but manifested in the real world, in reality, which made it, to me, much more sort of satisfying. This is in Austin. This was this thing that like no one knew if it was like a sculpture or if it was just like trash that someone had put there. But I loved that idea that it was like everyone was sure it was either art, right? This like, you know, the pinnacle, the expression of who we are as a culture, or it was trash. But it was like it had to be one or the other. And I loved that like uneasiness. And I feel like that way when I'm making my own work. Like, is this good or is this just totally horrible? Sometimes it's not as easy to know. So I took 3 years off in between undergrad and grad school living in New York. I knew I wanted to go back to grad school. I hadn't gone to art school. I wasn't even an art major at Wesleyan. So for me, it was really important. I wanted to go back and be part of like an art school community. I felt like there were things I didn't know or hadn't learned. So in 2014, I started at the Yale School of Art, studying with Gregory Crutzen, who runs the program there. And I was really making work in the same vein, the same way I've been making work for the past 3 years. Color, 4x5, suburban American landscape, right? Thinking about the same ideas, the same things, this juxtaposition of something beautiful and something ugly. This idea, it's like this beautiful sort of moment in nature, but it's really just like a water treatment facility. But that something could function as both those things. It can be both those things, right? And so really, I felt like this is the work that got me into grad school. This is what I do. This is me. I need to keep making work in this way, right? And I love the idea that like with like someone could talk about like their faith, just like on a windshield, right? Or the way people make these little shrines, like in the back of their cars. But my critiques were not very good. They weren't even that harsh as they can be. They were just like, everyone seemed bored. It seemed like, oh, you've done this before. You're just doing the same thing. I received a lot of critiques that like the photos seem static and still, which is, if you've ever worked with a 4x5, like very much, I mean, it's like you have to be so slow, right? You're shooting individual sheets of film. As soon as you put the film holder in, you can no longer see the image. So everything needs to stay still or else you have to take the film out and refocus. This is very much a product of how I was making the photographs. So I thought, all right, well, if I think these critiques are correct, which I did, it's like I need to figure out a way to change what I'm doing, right? Change how I'm making photographs. So, but that was hard because I thought of myself as like this color 4x5 natural light photographer. That's how I thought of myself, right? But one thing that's so great about grad school is it just pushes you so far beyond what you thought, who you thought you were or what you thought you did or what you thought was good, right? So I was like, at this point, it's winter in Connecticut, it's freezing. Just being outside with the 4x5 is terrible, especially because I'm from Texas, and no one's outside. I wanted to photograph people, no one's actually outside. So I was like, okay, I need to go indoors. But then working with 4x5, natural light indoors, very, very difficult. So I was like, I'm gonna use lights. So I started using strobes for the first time, other than just like a on-camera flash. And then it made no sense to shoot film because I was shooting flash. I couldn't tell what it was actually gonna look like, right? So I was like, okay, I need to shoot digitally. And as I was shooting, I hated the way the flash mixed, the color temperatures mixed with the available light, the fluorescent or incandescent light. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna go back to black and white. So I basically like reinvented everything I did, trying to get closer, right, to like the crux of what I actually wanted to say. I got out of what were comfort zones, right? Oh, this is how I make work, to actually figure out how can I best address what I want to say? How can I actually best do that technically, right? Even if that means venturing into uncomfortable territory, right? I also started casting a much wider net. Before, when I was making work with 4x5, you really have to know what the picture's going to be about before you even take it, right? With digital, you can shoot a lot more. So I was going to like, I'm not going to have such a clear idea of what I want to say, right? I'm going to start with a much wider set of possibilities and learn from the photographs. Try to like let the photographs teach me what was interesting or what I was interested in, right? So I just started photographing like everything that seemed interesting. Even if I didn't know what it was mean, or even if I didn't think it was going to be like my final project or portfolio or whatever. This is a bingo hall. Also like getting used to lights, like using strobes for the first time, figuring out what they did to the pictures, how they changed the meaning of the photographs. These were skaters in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I love the kind of like tight-knit, masculine, but also sort of like the way they cared for each other in a way. Like that was really interesting to me. This was like their disgusting couch that they all, hung out on. Someone cleaned up some blood on the bowl here. After critiques at Yale, we would always go to this dive bar nearby because they had $1 beers. And I started talking with these male strippers who worked there. And so I sort of got in with their troupe. They were called the Men of Eden. So I started following them around and photographing them at different clubs around Connecticut. And I think before, when I was making work, it had to be like, okay, this is what it means, and I'm going to show this at critique. And with this, it was much different. It was like, I don't know what this means. I don't know if it's going to end up in my portfolio, but I'm going to follow this thread, right? I'm going to see where it leads me. I should also say that I don't really ever show this work outside of artist talks. It's not that I don't like it. It's just I never found the form or the vessel, or it never became a project, but just to show you how I actually got to the community. So at a certain point, I really had to narrow the scope of what I was doing, right? If it was going to become a series, I had to have some parameters. I had to have, as anyone who's an artist or photographer knows, you have to have limitations, right? Or else it just sprawls out of control. So it was important that I cast this wide net, but now at this point I really had to narrow. I had to focus. And I started photographing Boy Scout meetings that were all happening in this church basement kind of annex building. And I really loved the way the space felt, the architecture of it, how generic but how specific it was, the linoleum floor. I loved how kind of blank, yet also how everyone knows that space, how familiar that type of space is in America, or at least in suburban spaces. And so I had the idea okay, I'm going to photograph anything that's happening in a church basement. That was sort of my first kind of real idea of what the series was going to be. So that could be Boy Scout meetings. I photographed Bible classes, New Age spiritual groups, which you see here, which is also in the show. Corporate team building exercises. I mean, it's sort of expanded from the idea of just a church basement into a community center type space. And the idea that for me, it was okay, at a certain point I was can I create my own fictional community center, right? Can I make it feel like all these activities or all these groups could be happening simultaneously in different rooms, right? I'm definitely not a documentary photographer. I don't think about myself in that way. But I'm definitely interested in the language of documentary and its proximity to the truth or to reality, right? The authority we give it because of how mimetic it is, how much it looks like reality, right? Even though, of course, it's not. But I pretty quickly realized I was not interested in okay, this isn't going to be my Boy Scout series. This is going to be my New Age series. And I was much more interested in the commonalities, what these groups shared. What did they all have in common? What were these people sort of looking for? And versus the differences, right? Versus oh, how different is this group from this group? What were actually the commonalities? What were people after, right? In an age where you can just be online, do everything on your computer, this is obviously pre-COVID, but why go to a church basement? Or why go to these groups? What are you after? What does it mean to be in physical space, in proximity to other human beings? And what meaning can we derive from that? And I think underlying most of these groups or activities, there is a search for either faith or self-improvement, sometimes just the company of others, just being with people, right? Obviously, in suburban spaces, we're so sequestered from one another. But yeah, almost thinking about it like a dollhouse. You go into one room and this is happening. You go into another room and this is happening. That's sort of how I started to conceive of the project, of what I was doing. This is a student Methodist group at University of Texas where I teach that I started photographing. I actually have kept photographing them for the last couple of years. And this is they do like a worship service, but then they have different activities, and this was a self-defense class. They had someone who was a martial artist come in. But I just loved, like, this is a simulation of violence, right? It is sort of an observational photo of a fiction, of something false, right? But I love how it's meant to simulate, you know, like a mugging or an attack, but it looks like an embrace. It looks like a hug. And you can, if you look at the print, which is on the wall over there, you can actually see he has love tattooed on his arm. And they were actually really good friends. So it was sort of, in a way, both this simulation of violence and actually a sort of tender moment of embrace. I'm really interested in the juxtaposition of images, the space between the photographs, right? How the meaning of an image is changed or altered by the image that comes before it, the image that comes after it, right? So I think a lot about the meaning happening between two pictures. Not necessarily the meaning is all located in one photograph or another photograph, but like what's happening actually in between when your brain is like, you know, moving between these images. Like what happens when you put this image next to this image, next to this image, right? How does that create a fictional universe, like from the building blocks of reality, of real people, real spaces? This is a community theater troupe that I photographed in New York City after I graduated. But again, I love this idea of like a simulation, like a fiction. Like I'm sort of doing this documentary style look at a fictional embodiment, right? Which I love, like photographing theater and community theater, especially when you don't have your costumes on, right? When it's more ambiguous than that, right? It's just a rehearsal. So I really found something, like I've sort of covered like 2 years here of shooting, but I really found something that I felt sustained me, that I was interested in, and that could really benefit from a sustained effort or project, and really a book. I really felt like I had so many images after 2.5 years, 3 years of shooting, that I really felt like a book was like the right format or vessel for this, just because I could have a lot of images, right? And that's like when I was working with C and the staff here, it's like having smaller images so I can have more on the wall. Because I hope the more you look at the images, the stranger they become, right? I certainly hope it's not, nothing is like really perfectly clarified, like, oh, I get it now. I hope when you're done like going to the exhibit, you're more confused than you were before. I think of the photographs as questions versus as answers. This image is in the book, it's not in the show here, but this is a moment where I really felt like blessed by the photo gods. So I was driving around, this was when I was still in grad school, I was photographing, driving around Connecticut, and really just like failing miserably, like not getting anything good. I photographed this like community board meeting, and I was like, oh, this will be cool. It's like a community center space, and the photos were so boring, because of course the meeting was so boring. And I was just like, oh my God, I just spent like 3 hours photographing this insanely boring meeting. I had critique the next week. I was like, what am I gonna do? So I went to Dunkin' Donuts, which are everywhere. Do you guys have Dunkin' Donuts in Portland? They're so bad. I don't know why they're everywhere in the Northeast. Like they're literally everywhere. And there's this really interesting man in a suit at this like weird Dunkin' Donuts that had like a sort of faux living room, library. I loved the ambiguity of it. And I was like, I had all my camera gear. I was like just getting a coffee. I was like, should I ask this guy to photograph him? But I was like, I'm not gonna bother him. These other groups, these other communities I'm photographing, I have permission to be there, right? But this was just a guy at Dunkin' Donuts. So I was like, I'm not gonna bother him. That's invasive, that's rude. So I just went back to like dejectedly eating my muffin and drinking my coffee, and I felt a tap on my shoulder, and it was this man, his name is Dr. Hans Gandhi, and he had come up to me and goes, will you take my photograph? And I was just like, oh my God. I was like, you know, I felt like I earned it because I had failed so miserably, right? And you're out and I think, you know, people think about, sometimes they'll think about photography, it's like, oh, you got lucky, right? But you make your own luck, right? By being out there and taking pictures and failing and shooting 8 hours, right? And getting nothing good. Like you make your own luck by being out there. And that was a moment I felt like kind of a faith, a certain faith, you know, in the process. This image is part of the diptych that's on the opposite wall here. This is a senior center program where it's dancing. It's sort of more like movement therapy exercise kind of thing, but I love how it felt sort of spiritual. Someone at the opening said it felt floaty, and I was like, yeah, it definitely feels very floaty. So eventually, I started working with a publisher, Mörel Books, and we published this series as a book in May 2020, which was the worst time to publish a photo book. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic. All the book fairs were canceled. All the in-person events were canceled. But I just felt I needed to get the work out there. Like, I was ready for it to be out there. I made these photos from 2015 to 2018, and then it was published in 2020, so there were additional couple years, right? So even though it was the pandemic, I was like, I'm just ready to put this out in the world. Because for me, it's it is so nice to have work out in the world, have this show here and get to hear what people think, just to not make work alone, right? In the dark. So here are a few spreads from the book, and these images are in the exhibition as well. And this is the last image. Well, it's actually kind of the second to last one because there's a small picture after the acknowledgements. But so I start with the apple that's on this wall, and then I end with sort of this curtain, this sort of curtain closing on the narrative. So that's what I have. I would love to take questions or answer anyone's questions. I hope that wasn't too boring. But yeah, so if there are any questions on any of the work, I'm more than happy to answer them. Yes?
Do you see the community as, do you think you'll revisit it as you go on in time, or do you want to close the curtain and move on?
Well, no, it's a good question, and I feel like if you're a photographer or an artist, it's that. It's really nerve-wracking, what is the next step, right? When are you done with something? When do you start something new? How do you let go of that? And I was fortunate that this work really kind of organically led me to another body of work, which is called The Four Pillars, which I actually just published my second monograph in October of that work. And it's a little bit different, but it really grew out of the photographs I made of a self-help group, which I started making in the community. This group is a non-denominational spiritual group in Connecticut, and the work really kind of flowed out of that. So I felt very lucky that I had that sort of transition. So it certainly inflected it, but it's also definitely ready to change things up, Yeah.
Yeah, that series that you have up was shot in one of your ways that you've been trying to use light to tell stories. And from my experience is that kind of light came from a certain period and a certain way of telling stories, mostly how you put things together or lighting up for a shot.
Yeah.
They were very basic, kind of very, very basic. Sort of like PowerPoint of the 1940s or 50s. And so it just has a certain era from my visual experience that came to me and colored it, because you don't see that very often.
Yeah.
And that was what was, it's ended, and that tends to suck the time out of when you're taking these pictures.
Yeah.
So these could have been the 1930s or 40s when people come together, mainly because I think of that, how you got that light.
Yeah.
To be timeless. I'm just very impressed with how you think about light and break that up and trying to make it as not just a lighting element, but some other kind of narrative element. And it's just quite something. And unusual. I still find it very unusual. And should I be feeling unusual? Or or should I work on this a little more?
Yeah. So is the era you're referencing the 40, an FSA or a 40s new documentary style? Yeah.
And newspapers.
Yeah.
You would have fold outs of how to do things.
Yeah.
And then you would have simple armed forces pictures.
Yeah.
Where you would just have a very simple setup. You would plug in, there would be a light, but you just seem to have a catalog in your head about how these things look, and you reproduce them, and it just comes out to me just in a language that's very fresh.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I was thinking about. And again, like, I definitely don't consider myself a documentary photographer, but I love that era of photography. And I love looking at like what I consider vernacular images, right? Of like armed forces or something, like looking at versus like, oh, I'm only looking at fine art photography, right, to influence me. Because obviously photography exists in so many different spheres, right, of culture. But definitely that was something that developed over time. And at first, like, you know, the lighting was horrible because I didn't know what I was doing. It was my first time using strobes, and it was much simpler, and it took a little while to arrive at something like this, where I hope the light functions in a slightly more expressionistic way, right, of creating like, oh, I could do that with the shadows. Like, it doesn't need to be perfectly evenly lit like a studio. Like, I can actually embrace the strangeness of where these shadows go. And I was talking to someone, kind of like an old school photographer. I was like, oh, your light should only mimic natural lighting. And I was just like, I'm interested in the opposite of that. Like, that's just like, I'm just so interested in doing the opposite of that. But yeah.
I do think that many of those types of photographs were done by, you know, more amateur photographers.
Yeah.
And village or town photographers,
Yeah.
taking pictures of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So it was also that kind of not an expert.
Yeah.
Not an art, you know, photographer by any means.
Yeah.
But just sort of trying to get a couple of shadows, which is, you know, wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a success. So I just like how the conversation just moves through all of this in the way that you had hoped.
Yeah.
Which is that it's about Americana and photography and storytelling, and I just think they're a great success.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I don't know if you know the work of Bill Wood. ICP published, in New York, published a book a couple years ago called Bill Wood's Business, and he was a commercial photographer in Dallas in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then he died, and Diane Keaton bought his archive and donated it to the ICP, and it's exactly what you're talking about, where it's like, but the photos, it's just unbelievable. The photos they're so inspiring to me, but it'll be like, the new vacuum shop opened up, right? Or like photographs of like, you know, the Elks Club, like, and it has that thing where it's like, it's a little bit too polished to just be like a handheld, you know, like snapshot, but it's also definitely referencing a certain vernacular kind of history for sure, yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. Did you have a question? I saw your hand up before.
Yeah, I was pretty interested in the text that went along with these photos.
Oh, yeah.
I got here like right at once. I didn't get to do my homework. But,
Yeah.
I saw that you had these like transcripts, and I'm wondering, since you talk so much about the juxtaposition between like documentation and reality and fiction, like are those real transcripts, or are they from your head? Are they imagined? Are they like they sit very firmly in a maybe?
Yeah.
For me, like they're very Schrodinger's
Yeah.
transcripts, I guess.
Well, that's good. I think I like the work to sit in a strange, like you don't know, right? Is this real? Is this not? So those are actually texts I commissioned a friend of mine who's an amazing writer. Her name is Maddie Crum. Her name's on the end of and one of those is included in the book that I published. And I personally, I don't love like explanatory text, like when you open up a photo book or an art book and there's someone really smart telling you what to think about the work. Because like I would much rather you look at the work like with preconceptions that you have, of course, everyone does, but without like someone explaining to you what it is. But I knew I wanted some kind of textual element. And so I commissioned those pieces where I just wanted them short stories set in the world of the photographs. So that is what I asked Maddie Crum to do, and she wrote 2, and I ended up using 1 in the book, but I absolutely love them because, yeah, it's like, are those transcripts from the meetings? Are they totally fictional? But they really felt like when I read them, like I was in those spaces. And that's why I just thought they worked really well. They were complementary to the photographs without being explanatory, you know, of the photographs. Because like, I hate when like you read an explanation of a song you love, and you like loved this song and it meant this thing to you, and then you read the explanation, it's like, oh, I was just like, it's about like a, you know, bagel, you know, and you're like, oh God, like I thought it was about, you know, the universe or something. So like I don't really want to like explicate, you know, like what it is. So anyway, that's what the text is.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Did you have a question then, Janet?
Yeah, I just had a question about your critiques at
Yeah.
Yale when beginning this process and look.
Yeah.
I I mean, when I think of like the Yale look and like Crutzen and like the Havelbergs that have come out of there, did you get any pushback like going black and white and digital, and like is there kind of an explanation as like how this like feeds into the story narrative other than necessity, which you already talked about? Like that you kind of had to defend the work with?
Yeah, I mean, I got much more pushback before I switched, when I was just doing the thing I always did, right? Because I think from the point of view of a grad school critique, it's like, well, what are you doing here? If you're gonna work the same way you were before, it's like, do you need to be here, right? How are you gonna push yourself? How are you gonna change yourself, right? And Gregory Crutzen always talks about radically reinventing your practice. That's like what he would say a lot. And so I think like when you start experimenting, or when I'll speak to my experience, when I started experimenting and changing things, the critiques got way more interesting. Much more interesting for sure. I mean, I certainly never felt a pressure like, oh, this is like a Yale look, or my work needs to look like Kurt Hadelberg's, who I think is incredible, but like I could never do that. You know, like I never felt like that, a pressure like that personally, when I was making the work. I will say that one thing I really did have to defend myself against, both in grad school and in the art world, is like documentary. Like, oh, these photographs look documentary. And people would say that, and they would mean it as a critique, an insult. And for me, that didn't mean, it wasn't insulting. Oh, absolutely, because they're like, oh, you're not, building the set, and you're not hiring an actor to play this person. Like, what are you even doing? And I think that when things are completely staged or set up or created, people understand, oh, this is art. You did all this work. And when a moment is just discovered or found or photographed, like for instance, Kurt Hadelberg's work, like people are like, well, is it art? Did you just document this moment, right? And like, yeah, I see no distinction, but I think that was something that I always felt a certain like pressure to like defend myself against. But yeah, that's a good question. But. And Janet and Chris?
So, were you actually spending time with these different groups as they did what they do in these spaces? And so you were able to observe quite a range of different kinds of groups coming together for different kinds of reasons. I'm just sort of wondering what, as having the opportunity to be that fly on the wall in so many different kinds of groups.
Yeah.
What did you take away from that? I am curious about it.
It's a really good question, and it was like pretty amazing. I mean, that is one thing. Like, if you're a photographer, that's like the camera is such a passport to like go places you never go. Right? It's like, if you're walking somewhere where you've never been before with a camera, it's like, oh, I'm photographing. If you do that without a camera, it's like, what are you doing? That's weird. Right. It's just this excuse to go places, and that's one thing I love about making photos in the world. Is it's like they're real people, they're communities I didn't know about. Like, I wasn't a Boy Scout. I'm Jewish, I wasn't really in these church spaces very much. Like, I was very curious about it, and it became a passport to see these. And that's what I mean, where like photography can teach you. Like, you can learn about the world as you make the photographs. I didn't need to know about this thing, before I made work about it. But yeah, it really depended also on the group. Like the Boy Scouts was tricky because obviously they're minors, and their issues. And so a lot of the groups I would go to without my camera, attend a meeting, and like with the Boy Scouts, I presented to the parents about what I was doing. And then they, decided if they weren't going to allow me to photograph. But yeah, a lot of the groups I would attend, if it was like a Bible class or a bingo hall, I would like go without my camera and be like, I'm Eli, this is what I'm doing, I'm observing. And if people didn't want to be photographed, I was going to photograph them. So yeah, that was also an issue. But I feel like I did learn a lot, just like being like, okay, this is like this new age ideology, right? Or this is a corporate team-only exercise. But that's exciting. Like, it's cool. It's like, I loved like learning about something, as I was making the photographs.
It's interesting because it sounds like you had to establish a certain amount of trust at the beginning. And as I look at a lot of these, and also in your larger book, it seems to me that issue of group trust is kind of a thread that runs through, because these these are all people who are trusting themselves to this group in
Yeah.
various ways on various levels, and it is kind of a profound thing, I think, in our day and age to see that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I always feel like the streetcar named Desire, like I rely on the kindness of strangers. And, you know, of people opening themselves up to me. And there are a lot of communities that do not allow me to photograph them. And I also respect that. And I don't want to be making photographs. I don't want of people who don't want to be photographed, right? Or, you know, sometimes like with this theater troupe that I photographed, I came in with all these ideas like, okay, I want you guys to act out a scene of like someone dying or a wedding. And the director was like, we don't have any time for that, dude. Like, we're going to rehearse our play and that's it. And I was like, all right, cool. Like, I'm gonna photograph that. And I loved what I ended up getting. So this image and then the image of the guy on the ground on the wall, you know, playing dead, those were both from that thing. But I loved that it was like, okay, well, I'm going to watch what you guys do, you know, versus my own ideas about what I want to photograph. But.
Yeah.
Chris, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that it's interesting that you know, your sort of pushback from the sort of Crutzen method of setting things up and all that, sort of say, well, you know, how are you, you're just looking at the scene, you're just documenting it, but I mean, it's so much about how you look at it. I mean, today you said, oh yeah, you switched to black and white because you didn't like the color, balance is not matching. But at the opening you were saying, you know, color was making it too much, that it was shot recently, and the black and white makes it more ambiguous what decade it was and stuff.
Yeah.
So I think there's a way in which sort of it's a scene that would be photographed completely differently by 12 different people.
Yeah.
You know, and if you look at like Chauncey Hare's Interior America, where he's looking at, he could be looking at things that way, but he was looking at things like, look how screwed up this is.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so those pictures are fascinating.
Yeah.
But they're not at all the pictures that you would have made in that situation. And I think the idea somehow that there has to be technical complication to make it be art. That was in the earliest history of photography.
Yeah.
Like, you can't just take a picture. You have to collage together 15 different pictures.
Exactly. Or it has to be a pictorialist. You know, it has to look like a painting or something. You know. Yeah.
It's so sort of flawed. And here, this is so rich. I mean, I love what you're saying about, you know, you bring your experience to it. I'm not going to tell you what to see. You see what you see. And we're seeing through your eyes, so we're seeing your point of view, but we're also, it's a conversation. Ours too.
No, it's a great point. And I will say, just being honest, like the reason I switched to black and white was in response to a technical issue, but you're right, like the pictures, and this goes back to your comment, it's like the black and white makes it temporally way more ambiguous, right? Especially because the spaces don't really change. Like the spaces are pretty static, right? And so it's timeless, not in like timeless elegance, but sort of like I actually don't know what time this is, you know? And the black and white helps with that. I think that black and white helps a lot with making it feel more fictional. Like it's not the real world. I think in color it looks a little bit more familiar. And I think in black and white there's a little bit more defamiliarization of like, is this real? Is this not? Is this observational? Is it staged? And that's like the exact area where I want to be, you know, as an artist. But.
And you shooting this in RAW, so you also have it in color?
Yeah.
So it's not a theoretical question.
Yeah,
I've seen them both ways.
exactly. Yeah.
So I've got two. One is, you said you were in Eritrea,
Yes.
and have you published that stuff?
I did, yeah. And so that series is what won the Aperture Portfolio Prize in 2016. And I published like an artist book of, it was small, but it was images that like folded out sort of as posters of that work as well. Yeah. Wait, pardon me?
I taught Eritreans.
Really?
In Cape Town.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Which is pretty strange stuff.
Yeah.
The second question is, what are you on to now? Or what's the next project?
Yeah. So I just published my second book. It's called The Four Pillars. And it grew out of this, but it's quite different. I think it's a little bit more directed. It is a little bit more controlled. And it owes, the style I think owes a little bit less to documentary and a little bit more to kind of cinema in a way. But it all grew out of this new age self-help group that I was photographing. They're not all photographs, most of them are not photographs of the group, but they're things that were inspired by the ideas. It's sort of about conformity, shame, social forces, what causes us to act a certain way or behave a certain way, to limit our identities or who we are. I mean, that is in this work too. Pledging yourself to a certain identity, to certain values. But so it's a sort of grew out of this, but sign of a change.
This image, I'd love to see it like a Nicholas Nixon thing of the same group in 5 years.
I know, yeah. Oh my God, I know, yeah. I would love that too. And there's a book in the library, Mark Goodman's photographs, and he taught at UT before I did. And he has photographs like that in the book in the library where it's like he went back to this town in New York and photographed people over the years. And it's incredible. So I would, it was a challenge though, working with adolescents. It was because I had all these lights and I would say, okay guys, don't look at the lights, they're really bright, which of course I shouldn't have said because then they all went up and stood by the lights and just and then they're like, I can't see anything. And I was like, oh God, the Boy Scouts are probably the hardest group I photographed. But, yeah.
Yeah, I just, I've seen this a number of times and I just saw it again differently because that kid sort of removed himself from the group, and now he's by himself in the center of the photograph.
Yeah.
2 more feet away and it would have been this, an entirely different photograph.
Yeah.
So it's both a place to come together as a group and one team, but it's also, you can step out in the middle of the aisle, and they'll take a picture.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much that is going on before and after. This is what I think a lot of photographs hope for and don't get, and that's why I'm just kind of talking this day, because I think these work constantly, and that's pretty good.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree, and I made many images that did not work to get to this. And originally, one of my things with the Boy Scouts was like I brought all these Norman Rockwell paintings and drawings of the Boy Scouts, and I was like to them, and I was like, all right, we're gonna reenact these, and I did all these photos, and they were okay, but they weren't. And then it was just the thing of like, okay, I'm gonna photograph you guys doing the Boy Scout salute. That was like, this is so much better than my idea. And I love just a photo of. Yes,
men back too, which is also, I think, really important for me, a really important element of it. It's both kind of touching, like, oh, they're mentoring, and it's also kind of creepy.
Well, also it's like the people they're going to become, right? And also there are like the old men, and then there are these representations of even older men, which are like saints because it's in a church, so these are like saints. So I mean, that's why I love taking pictures like in the real world, not because I think it's in any way really more truthful than setting something up, but I just think they're just these little details that you get. Like I would have never thought.
The real world is so much better at figuring things out and that are cool than you could ever be just with your mind.
Exactly. I would have never thought, like, oh, I'm going to hang up pictures of saints, but yeah, no, it's,
I'm curious because like this one in particular, but in some of the others too, I get the sense of I've never felt so alone than being in a group, that feeling.
That's good.
And I'm wondering as you started playing with shadow or playing with, tone, did you could obviously warm this up and it would have a completely different look.
Yeah.
Was there a trial and error in trying to find that look?
Like the actual tonality of the...
This is flat to me and cold.
Yeah.
Would you take something and go, ooh, that's too warm, that doesn't work as what I'm trying to say, or not necessarily?
Do you mean like literally because they're obviously they're monochromatic. So I want them to be like as neutral as possible, but like
I almost feel I see them as neutral, but it's almost past neutral. A little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's maybe just this one or some of them.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, it is also like I am not a member of these communities or these groups, so I think there probably is some feeling of distance, because I'm just not. I don't want to pretend like I am or like that I have some, insight into like what's going on. So I mean, maybe that's part of like what you're responding to.
Looking into it.
Yeah, that I'm sort of an outsider who's there, who's allowed to be there, but not like embraced or one of them. It's an interesting question. All right, well, thank you guys so much. I'm happy to hang out and answer this.